Madison watched the human ship on her scanner with a mixture of fear and fascination. The vessel was still maintaining its distance, but she could feel the weight of its presence through space itself. The captain's voice still echoed in her mind, speaking words that challenged everything her civilization believed about themselves. She had grown up believing that elves were the pinnacle of advancement, that humans were crude and simple beings who had only recently figured out how to leave their home planet. Now she was questioning everything. Stormfire and Thornwhisper returned to her fighter ship through the cargo bay, their forms solidifying as they re-entered the pressurized cabin. The smaller dragon, Thornwhisper, made a concerned chirping sound that Madison felt through their mental connection. The dragon knew that this situation had changed something fundamental in their world. Madison reached out and touched both dragons on their foreheads, a gesture of reassurance that did not ease her own racing thoughts. She knew that returning home would be dangerous now. She had attacked human military vessels. Even if she tried to explain that they had fired first, the Council of Elders would never believe her. The Elders always looked for reasons to dismiss anything that contradicted their worldview. They would likely arrest her for reckless endangerment and conspiracy. They might even banish her from Orion society entirely, but she could not hide in space forever. She had to return home and try to convince her people of what she had learned. Madison set her course toward the Orion homeworld and engaged her faster than light engines. The jump through hyperspace was disorienting as always, but she used the time to think about her next move. She had to find allies among her people. There had to be others who understood that change was coming, that the old ways were no longer sufficient for survival. She thought of her father, who had always encouraged her to think for herself and to question authority. He would believe her. He had to believe her. The journey home took 3 hours. When Madison finally emerged from hyperspace and saw her homeworld below her, she felt a strange mixture of emotions. The planet was beautiful, with endless forests of crystalline trees that glowed softly in the light of her sun. The cities of her people were elegant structures that seemed to grow from the landscape rather than being built upon it. Everything about her home spoke of harmony and perfection, but now Madison knew that perfection was an illusion. Danger was real and it was coming. She landed her fighter at a private hangar near her family home instead of the official spaceport. She could not risk being intercepted by military authorities before she had a chance to talk to her father. Stormfire and Thornwhisper followed her out of the vessel, and immediately the dragons began acting strangely. They moved with their heads lowered, sensing something in the air that Madison could not perceive. The larger dragon growled softly, a sound like distant thunder rolling across a summer sky. Madison's family home was built into the side of a crystal mountain, its walls transparent to allow the inhabitants to see the landscape beyond. It was a place of beauty and peace, a place where Madison had spent her entire childhood learning about art, music, and magic. As she approached the entrance, she saw her father waiting for her on the outer terrace. His name was Aldrin, and he had been expecting her arrival even though Madison had sent no message. Aldrin was tall and graceful like all elves, with silver hair that fell past his shoulders and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of centuries. He looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. Before Madison could speak, her father pulled her into an embrace and whispered that he already knew what had happened. He had been monitoring the communications networks and had heard the first reports of the human ship and the destroyed diplomatic shuttle. He knew that his daughter had been involved, and he knew that she would come to him first. Madison felt tears streaming down her face as she held her father. She tried to explain what had happened, how her uncle had been killed in the human attack, how she had defended herself and her dragons against superior forces. Aldrin listened without interrupting, his hand gentle on her shoulder. When she finally finished speaking, her father simply nodded and told her that they needed to go to the council chambers immediately. The elders needed to hear her story directly from her, not through filtered reports or official channels. Madison was terrified at the prospect of facing the council, but she also felt grateful to have her father's support. They walked through the beautiful corridors of their home, and Madison noticed that Stormfire and Thornwhisper seemed agitated. The dragons sensed danger approaching, or perhaps they were simply reacting to Madison's own anxiety. Her father assured her that the dragons would be safe in his home. The council would not harm them without understanding what they truly were. The council chambers were located in the heart of the great city of Orel, a structure that had stood for over 50,000 years. The building itself seemed to pulse with ancient magic, its walls covered in inscriptions that told the history of the elven civilization. Madison and her father entered the main hall where the 7 elders sat upon thrones of crystal and starlight. At the center sat the eldest of them all, a being named Aelendor who was older than human civilization itself. He had seen the rise and fall of countless species and believed himself to be beyond the reach of any real threat. The council listened as Madison told her story. She described the human ship, the destruction of the diplomatic shuttle, the attack from the human fighters, and her counterattack with her dragons. She spoke clearly and calmly, refusing to let her fear show in her voice. She showed them the scanner data from her fighter, the recordings of the human communications, everything that proved her account was true. When Madison finished speaking, the council fell silent. Aelendor rose from his throne and approached her. His eyes, which had seemed kind moments before, now held something cold and distant. He told Madison that her story was impossible. He said that humans could not have such advanced weapons technology. He said that the elven diplomatic shuttle would have had defensive capabilities that no human ship could possibly penetrate. He suggested that Madison was either lying or suffering from some kind of psychological breakdown brought on by stress and fear. Madison felt anger rising inside her. She had come to tell the truth and they were refusing to listen. This was exactly what she had feared. Her father spoke up in her defense, telling the council that his daughter was trustworthy and that her evidence was solid. He demanded that they send a military ship to investigate the destroyed diplomatic vessel and the area where the encounter had taken place. Aelendor looked at Aldrin with something that might have been pity and told him that he was allowing his paternal emotions to cloud his judgment. The council voted to place Madison under house arrest pending an official investigation. Her father was stripped of his position in the governmental hierarchy as punishment for supporting his daughter's claims. Madison was led away by guards, her mind reeling from what had just happened. She had tried to save her people and they had repaid her by treating her like a criminal. She did not understand how they could be so blind, so unwilling to see the evidence that was right in front of them. That night, as Madison sat in her room and stared out at the stars through the transparent walls of her family home, she heard the sound of alarms echoing across the city. Red lights began to blink in sequence, a signal that meant only one thing. Something terrible had been detected. Something impossible had happened. Madison rushed to the communication terminal and listened as the emergency broadcasts flooded the networks. A human ship had entered Orion airspace. But it was not the same ship that Madison had encountered before. This was something far larger and far more dangerous. The human ship had appeared directly over the capital city without warning or permission. It was broadcasting a single message, the same message repeated over and over in 1,000 different languages. The message was simple and terrifying. The humans were here to assess Orion civilization's threat level. They wanted to know if the elves were ready to surrender peacefully, or if they would prefer to learn the hard way what happened when you tried to fight against the Terran Empire. Madison looked out at the horizon and saw a massive shadow passing over the city. The human ship descended through the clouds like a judge passing judgment from the heavens above. She knew that this moment would define everything that was to come. The elves would have to fight now, whether they believed in the threat or not. The question was whether they would be ready. The guards who had been assigned to watch Madison suddenly vanished from their posts. The entire city was in chaos as the massive human warship continued its descent toward the planet's surface. Madison realized that this was her chance. She moved quickly through the corridors of her home, gathering whatever supplies she could carry. She had to reach her father and get them both to safety before the situation deteriorated further. When she found Aldrin, he was already packed and ready to move. He had anticipated that the guards would abandon their posts when the true threat became apparent. Her father looked at her with eyes that held deep sadness mixed with determination. He told Madison that she had been right all along, and that the council's refusal to listen might cost them everything. He told her that they needed to get to the spaceport and commandeer a military transport vessel that could take them far from the capital city. Madison and her father ran through the streets of Orel, moving like ghosts through the illuminated pathways. The city around them was descending into panic. Citizens were fleeing their homes, merchants were abandoning their shops, and the few military units that existed in the city were hastily assembling at strategic locations. The human warship had come to rest in the sky directly above the council chambers, as if deliberately positioning itself to dominate the seat of elven power. They made it to the private spaceport where Madison kept her fighter. Her father immediately began accessing the computer systems, using his administrative credentials to unlock the doors to a military transport ship. The vessel was designed to carry small groups of officials and diplomats to important meetings across the elven territories. It was heavily shielded and fast, exactly what they needed. Madison helped her father power up the engines while keeping watch for any military personnel who might try to stop them. Stormfire and Thornwhisper emerged from the shadows where they had been waiting, their forms shimmering with barely contained energy. The dragons sensed the danger around them and moved with purposeful steps toward the transport ship. Madison had bonded with these creatures so deeply that they seemed to know her thoughts before she could voice them. The dragons had become an extension of her will, partners in whatever came next. As the transport ship began to rise from the landing pad, Madison looked back at her beautiful city one final time. She could see the massive human warship beginning to transmit powerful signal pulses that disrupted communications across the entire continent. The elegant spires of Orel's buildings seemed to glow brighter in response to the human vessel's presence, as if the city itself was crying out in protest at this invasion of its airspace. Madison's father plotted a course to one of the outer settlements, a place called Crystalline Haven that lay deep in the mountain ranges far from the cities. It was a place where some of the more independent elves lived, those who had rejected the council's authority and built their own communities. Madison had only heard stories about this place. She did not even know if it truly existed, or if it was just a legend that rebellious elves told each other to comfort themselves. The communication systems of their vessel suddenly came alive, with the voice of the human commander again. This time the message was directed at any elves who could hear it. The commander said that the Terran Empire had been monitoring elven space for some time. He said that his people had discovered evidence that the elves had been conducting hidden military research and development of weapons that violated various interstellar treaties. He said that unless the elves surrendered their military capabilities immediately, the humans would have no choice but to enforce compliance through direct action. Madison felt cold dread settle in her stomach. She knew that there was no way the elves could surrender their military now, even if they wanted to. Surrender meant subjugation, meant giving up their independence and their right to self-determination. The elves would fight. They had no other choice. But could they actually win a war against a civilization that had already proven itself superior in combat? Madison did not know the answer, and that uncertainty terrified her more than anything else. As they traveled toward Crystalline Haven, Aldrin told his daughter about his own past. He explained that when he was younger, he had been part of a secret group of elves who believed that the Council's policies of isolation and denial were dangerous. He had studied human history in the Forbidden Archives just as Madison had. He had come to many of the same conclusions that his daughter had reached. He had even prepared contingency plans for a day when human contact became inevitable. Aldrin revealed to Madison that there were hidden military facilities scattered throughout the elven territories. These facilities had been built in secret, hidden away from the official knowledge of the Council. They were stocked with weapons and defensive technologies that were actually more advanced than anything the official military used. Aldrin had been part of the group that had created these facilities, and he had the access codes and locations of each one memorized. Madison listened to her father's revelations with a sense of wonder, mixed with concern. She asked him why he had never told her about these places before. Aldrin explained that he had hoped they would never need to be used, that the secret threat would eventually be discovered and addressed through normal governmental channels. He had been naive in his optimism. The Council had chosen to remain blind until it was almost too late. Their transport vessel approached the mountain range where Crystalline Haven was supposed to be located. The sensors showed nothing on the standard scans, but Aldrin knew where to look. He activated an old override code that revealed a hidden landing zone, camouflaged by ancient magic and sophisticated technology. A hidden valley appeared on their displays, filled with buildings that had been built into the crystalline structures of the mountains themselves. As they descended into the valley, Madison could see that there were hundreds of elves living here. This was no small settlement. This was an entire civilization hidden from the eyes of the council and the cities. There were workshops and training facilities, weapons manufactories and defensive installations. There were also homes and gardens, places where families lived ordinary lives despite being hidden from the rest of the world. They landed in a designated bay, and immediately they were surrounded by armed elves wearing military uniforms. A tall female elf with scarred features and sharp eyes approached their vessel. Her name was Lise, and she was the military commander of Crystalline Haven. She looked at Aldrin with recognition and nodded, as if this moment had been expected. She told Aldrin that the council had finally revealed its true nature, and that all of those who had prepared for this day should now feel justified in their caution. Madison stepped out of the transport vessel with her dragons, and Lisa's eyes widened with genuine surprise. She had heard stories of the dragons, but she had never believed that they truly existed. When Stormfire and Thornwhisper emerged from behind Madison, their scales glowing with ethereal light, Lise fell to one knee. She told Madison that ancient legends spoke of dragons being bonded to chosen warriors who would lead the elven people in their darkest hour. Lise explained that the military forces of Crystalline Haven were already mobilizing. They had been expecting a human incursion for many years, ever since the first signs of an expanding Terran civilization had been detected by hidden scouts. The elves of this hidden community had been preparing for this war for a long time. They had weapons and tactics designed specifically to counter human military technology. Aldrin and Lise began discussing strategies while Madison walked through the settlement in a daze. She had come from a world that denied the possibility of conflict and discovered that there had been an entire civilization preparing for war all along. The elves she had thought were peaceful and civilized had actually been forging themselves into weapons. The beautiful, refined culture she had grown up in was built on a foundation of denial and willful ignorance. That night, Madison stood on the edge of the hidden valley and looked up at the stars. She could see the human warship in the distance, a point of light that seemed to grow larger with each passing moment. Tomorrow the war would begin in earnest. The questions that had plagued her since she first read the ancient warnings would finally be answered. The humans had come, and now the elves would have to decide what they were truly made of. The war room of Crystalline Haven was a place of controlled chaos. Holographic displays showed the positions of all known human military forces and elven defensive installations. Commanders moved pieces across three-dimensional maps, planning strategies and calculating probabilities. Lise stood at the center of this controlled frenzy, her sharp eyes taking in every detail, every potential weakness in their defenses. Madison stood beside her father as Lise explained the situation to the assembled commanders. The human warship was just one vessel, but it was a command and control ship for a larger battle group. There were supply ships, troop transports, and fighter squadrons being held in position just beyond the outer reaches of the Orion system. The humans were not here for a quick raid. They were here to establish a foothold and build up their military presence in the region. The human commander had given them an ultimatum. They had 12 hours to surrender or face the consequences. The council in Aurel had predictably refused to capitulate to any human demands. They were even now mobilizing what few military forces they had available, calling up old weapon systems that had not been used in hundreds of years. Most of these weapons had likely degraded or become unreliable from lack of maintenance. It was a desperate gesture that would accomplish nothing except to accelerate the conflict. Lise turned to Madison and asked her directly about what she had experienced in her encounter with the human fighters. She wanted to know every detail about their combat tactics, their weapon systems, their evasion patterns. Madison described everything she could remember, how the humans had anticipated her moves, how they had attacked with precision and overwhelming firepower. She told Lise about the mental link she shared with her dragons, how that connection had allowed her to coordinate with Stormfire and Thornwhisper in a way that seemed to surprise the human pilots. Aldrin suggested that the dragons might be their greatest asset in this conflict. He explained to the commanders that the dragons were not bound by the same physical limitations as starfighters. They existed partially in a mystical realm alongside the material world, which meant they could potentially move through space in ways that human sensors could not easily track. Stormfire and Thornwhisper seemed to understand what was being discussed about them. They moved closer to Madison and made sounds that seemed almost like agreement. Lise made a decision right then. She told Madison that she would be placed in command of the Dragonflight, a new division that would operate independently of the traditional military hierarchy. Madison's role would be to coordinate with the dragons and use them to strike at the human forces in ways that conventional tactics could not achieve. She would report directly to Lise, and she would have access to all the resources that Crystalline Haven could provide. Madison felt the weight of this responsibility settle on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She had never been trained as a military commander. She had learned combat through instinct and practice, not through formal education. But she also knew that she was uniquely qualified for this role. No other elf had ever bonded with dragons the way she had. No one else could coordinate with them in the way that she could. The next several hours were spent in intense preparation. Madison worked with the engineering teams to develop specialized equipment that could interface with her fighter ship and with the dragons themselves. They created a communication system that would allow her to receive battle information directly into her consciousness, shared through the link she had with Stormfire and Thornwhisper. They outfitted her fighter with new weapon systems that had been designed specifically to counter human technology. Stormfire seemed to understand that a great trial was coming. The massive silver dragon spent hours in meditation, his scales glowing brighter as he drew power from the mystical forces that permeated the hidden valley. Thornwhisper, smaller but no less powerful, created patterns of emerald light in the air as she practiced her offensive abilities. Madison watched her dragons prepare themselves and felt a strange sense of confidence begin to replace her fear. As midnight approached and the deadline grew nearer, the commanders of Crystalline Haven received a message from the underground resistance fighters who operated throughout the elven cities. These were elves who had been working in secret for years, preparing for this moment. They told of preparations underway in various locations, of weapons being moved into position, of civilians being evacuated to safer areas. The entire elven civilization was mobilizing for war, whether the council acknowledged it or not. Madison stood on the observation deck of the hidden settlement and looked up at the night sky. She could see the human warship with her unaided eyes now, a massive structure that seemed to block out the stars around it. She wondered what the human commander was thinking as the deadline approached. Did he believe that the elves would surrender? Did he understand the depth of the resistance that was forming against his invasion? Stormfire appeared beside Madison, his massive form somehow graceful despite his size. The dragon pressed his great head against her shoulder in a gesture of comfort and affection. Through their mental link, Madison felt the dragon's emotions. Stormfire was ready. He had been waiting for this moment since he was an egg, waiting to prove that dragons were not just creatures of myth and legend, but powerful allies in times of conflict. Aldrin approached his daughter and told her that he was proud of her. He said that she had been right from the beginning, that her instincts had served her well. He told her that whatever happened in the coming battle, she had already accomplished something remarkable. She had awakened her people to a truth that they had tried very hard to ignore. He told her to go into this fight knowing that she was not doing it for glory or personal achievement, but for the survival of everyone she loved. The moment of the deadline arrived. All across the elven territories, military forces took their positions. In Crystalline Haven, the commanders activated the defensive shields that had been in place for centuries. Madison took her seat in her fighter ship, feeling the power of its engines thrumming through her body. Stormfire and Thornwhisper coiled themselves in the cargo bay, ready to launch into space the moment the battle began. The human warship transmitted a final message. It was no longer directed at the government or the military. It was directed at the general population of Orion. The human commander asked all elves to consider whether their leaders were worth dying for. He asked them to consider the alternative of peaceful submission to the Terran Empire. He told them that humans had conquered and absorbed hundreds of civilizations, that very few of them had regretted the choice to surrender rather than fight. Madison found herself angered by this message. The idea that anyone would willingly submit to conquest, that anyone would accept subjugation of their people and their culture, seemed incomprehensible to her. She thought about the ancient warning in the archives. Fear the Earthborn, not because they were stronger or more advanced, but because they were willing to do things that other civilizations were not willing to do. They would conquer without hesitation. They would subjugate without mercy, and they seemed to believe that this was not just acceptable but inevitable. Just as the deadline passed, Alarms began to sound throughout Crystalline Haven. The human warship was launching attack shuttles toward the planet's surface. They were beginning their assault on the capital city of Orel and the surrounding territories. The war had begun. Madison activated her engine systems and launched her fighter into the sky. Stormfire and Thornwhisper materialized beside her vessel, their forms becoming visible as they prepared for battle. Behind her, other elven fighters began to launch from hidden bays throughout the valley. It was time to show the humans what the elves were truly capable of. It was time to prove that some civilizations would not go gently into subjugation. The battle for the skies above Orion was unlike anything Madison had ever imagined. The human attack shuttles descended in coordinated waves, their weapon systems raining fire down on the elven cities below. But the elves were ready. Defensive systems that had been hidden for centuries suddenly activated, creating shields of pure energy that protected the population centers from the worst of the assault. Madison guided her fighter toward the largest concentration of human attack shuttles, her dragons flying in perfect synchronization beside her vessel. Stormfire and Thornwhisper moved like liquid silver and emerald through the chaos of combat, their forms almost impossible for human targeting systems to lock onto. The dragons had abilities that went beyond simple physical movement. They could phase partially into the mystical realm, making themselves harder to hit and allowing them to strike at targets in ways that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The first human shuttle was taken down by a coordinated assault. Stormfire released a blast of thermal energy, while Thornwhisper created a barrier of emerald force that trapped the shuttle in a pocket of absolute zero cold. The human vessel's shields failed under the stress, and the shuttle began to fall toward the planet's surface. Madison watched through her fighter's displays as human ejection pods launched from the dying vessel. She felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and regret. She had hit her target, but she also understood that there were living beings inside that shuttle who would die if those escape pods failed. More human shuttles descended, and the battle intensified. Madison coordinated with the other elven fighter pilots, sharing tactical information and trying to create overlapping fields of fire that would make it harder for the humans to break through. The human pilots were skilled, she had to admit that. They adapted quickly to the presence of the dragons, modifying their tactics to try to separate the magical creatures from her fighter. But Madison and her dragons were connected in ways that went beyond mere military coordination. They moved as a single entity, their thoughts linked through the bond that had grown between them over the years. Lisa's voice came through on the command channel. She was directing the overall defense from the hidden war room, monitoring multiple battle zones across the entire planet. She told Madison that her performance was exceeding all expectations. She told Madison to continue her current course and to push the attack deeper into the human formation. The dragon flight was creating gaps in the human offensive that the other elven forces could exploit. Madison pushed her fighter harder, accelerating toward another cluster of human shuttles. But this time the humans were ready for her. A flight of human fighter aircraft broke away from their escort duties and moved to intercept her. They were faster and more maneuverable than she had expected, and they were attacking with a precision that showed they had studied the recordings of her first encounter with them. Thornwhisper sensed the danger and repositioned herself between Madison's fighter and the incoming human aircraft. The small green dragon created a shield of pure magical force that deflected the first volley of human weapons fire. But more fire came and more, until even the dragon's defenses began to show signs of strain. Madison realized that the humans had analyzed her fight tactics and developed countermeasures. They were using overwhelming firepower to try to push through the dragon's defenses, rather than trying to outmaneuver them. She called out a new attack pattern to Stormfire through their mental link. The larger dragon responded instantly, launching himself at the human fighters with a fury that seemed to be drawn from the depths of the planet itself. Stormfire's thermal attacks forced the human pilots to take evasive action, creating openings that Madison could exploit. She guided her fighter through the chaos of combat, her weapon systems locking onto targets and releasing devastating bursts of energy. One by one, the human fighters began to fall. Some of the pilots managed to eject and escape, their parachutes opening above the elven cities below. Others were not so fortunate. Madison felt a wave of sadness wash over her as she saw another human pilot fail to escape his dying aircraft. She did not want to kill these people. She wanted them to go back to their own space and leave her world alone. But that option was no longer available. The war was real and it was happening whether she wanted it or not. More reports came through from Lise. The human warship was preparing to launch a more devastating assault. They were moving into a position where it could bring its primary weapons to bear on the capital city directly. If they succeeded, thousands of elves would die in the initial strike. The defenses would be overwhelmed and the city would fall. Madison received new orders. She was to lead a desperate attack on the human warship itself. It was a suicide mission in the eyes of many, an attempt to damage the warship enough that it could not launch its assault on the cities. Madison understood what this meant. There was a strong possibility that she would not survive the attempt. She told Stormfire and Thornwhisper what they were being asked to do. Through their mental link, she felt their commitment. The dragons were willing to follow her into the heart of the human forces, willing to risk their lives in defense of the elven people. It was a choice born of love and loyalty, not of coercion or compulsion. Madison guided her fighter and her dragons toward the massive human warship. The closer they got, the larger the vessel seemed to become. It was an incredible feat of human engineering, she had to admit. The warship was covered in weapon systems and defensive technologies that made the vessel look like a floating fortress of steel and power. The human ship's defenses activated as soon as they got within range. Laser cannons and missile pods began firing in coordinated patterns designed to create zones of devastation that nothing could survive. Madison pushed her fighter through the fire, her shields flaring with each impact. Behind her, Stormfire and Thornwhisper wove through the incoming fire with an almost supernatural grace. Stormfire launched a massive thermal attack directly at the warship's main reactor core. The location had been identified by the Elven intelligence services during their preparation for this conflict. The dragon's attack struck true, creating a massive explosion that lit up the night sky like a second sun. The warship's shields flickered and failed under the strain of the attack. Thornwhisper followed up with an assault of pure magical energy that tore through the warship's outer hull. The emerald bolts of force carved through the human vessel like a knife through silk, creating breaches that began to decompress entire sections of the ship. Madison could see escape pods launching from the warship as the human crew realized what was happening. Alarms began blaring across all of Madison's communication channels. Other human ships were jumping into the Orion system. The main human battle fleet was arriving to support the damaged warship. The attack had brought the true threat into the open. This was no longer a probe or a limited military incursion. This was the beginning of a full-scale invasion. Madison guided her fighter away from the damaged warship, her dragons following close behind. She could see dozens of new human vessels appearing in space, their targeting systems already coming online. The situation had changed in an instant, from a localized conflict to a struggle for the very survival of the Elven civilization. Lisa's voice came through on the communication channel again, this time with a message that changed everything. She told Madison that the hidden military forces of Crystalline Haven were being mobilized for a massive coordinated strike. All of the secret weapons that had been developed in hidden factories and hidden laboratories would be deployed in a single, overwhelming assault. Madison was being given a new role. She would lead the dragon flight in support of this attack, striking at the human fleet while the main assault was being conducted. Madison looked at Stormfire and Thornwhisper, and she saw the reflection of her own determination in their eyes. They had come through the first battle intact and victorious. Now they would face the true test of their abilities. The hidden weapons facilities of Crystalline Haven began their activation sequences simultaneously. Massive railguns emerged from concealed positions in the mountains, their barrels rotating to point toward the human fleet above the planet. Energy weapons that had been powered down for centuries hummed to life, drawing power from the mystical energies that flowed through the planet itself. The elves had prepared for this moment so carefully, so thoroughly, that Madison realized her people had been planning this conflict for longer than she had even been alive. The coordinated assault began at Lisa's command. Thousands of elven military personnel who had been hidden in secret bases throughout the Orion system began their attack on the human fleet. The response was immediate and devastating. Waves of energy weapons tore into the human vessels, creating explosions that lit up the darkness of space like artificial stars. Ships that had seemed invulnerable moments before began to falter under the onslaught. Madison guided her fighter into the chaos, her dragons moving with her through the destruction of human military hardware. This was different from the earlier battle. This was not about defense or escaping danger. This was about overwhelming force meeting overwhelming force in a struggle for dominance. The humans responded to the assault with their own furious counterattack, coordinating their remaining ships into defensive formations that were designed to maximize mutual protection. Stormfire and Thornwhisper worked together in a way that Madison had not seen before. The dragons seemed to understand tactics at a level that went beyond simple instinct. Stormfire would create a distraction with an aggressive thermal assault, while Thornwhisper positioned herself to strike at the human vessels from an unexpected angle. Their coordination suggested an intelligence that was far beyond what most people attributed to dragons. They were not simply magical creatures. They were conscious beings with the ability to strategize and adapt. Madison's communication system filled with voices, reports from the other Dragonflight pilots, from the military commanders, from civilian support personnel coordinating the defense. The human fleet was being pushed back, their formation broken by the coordinated elven assault. Several human ships were already disabled and drifting, their hulls breached and their crews struggling to maintain basic life support systems. But there was also a cost. Elven fighters were being destroyed, their pilots ejecting or dying in combat. The beautiful crystal structures of defensive installations were being damaged or destroyed by human counterattacks. Madison had to force herself to stay focused on her mission, rather than dwelling on the losses. In war, there were always losses. The goal was to minimize them while achieving overall victory. Aldrin's voice came through on a private channel. He was coordinating the civilian evacuation from the threatened areas, while also helping to direct some of the military operations. He told his daughter that the main human carrier ship had been damaged but not destroyed. It was beginning to maneuver away from the planet, attempting to create distance between itself and the planet's defensive installations. If that ship managed to escape, it would likely carry with it information about the elven military capabilities. The humans would adapt and return with a more powerful fleet. Madison made a decision without consulting with Lyce or any of the other commanders. She redirected her fighter and her dragons toward the massive human carrier vessel. The ship was moving faster than she had expected, its engines driving it away from the planet at incredible speed. But Madison's fighter was faster than conventional human vessels, and her dragon seemed to move through space as if the normal laws of physics were merely suggestions they could choose to ignore. She closed the distance rapidly, knowing that she was running low on fuel and weapons ammunition. This attack would have to be perfect or it would all be for nothing. As she approached the carrier ship, she realized just how massive it truly was. The vessel was the size of a small city, bristling with defensive systems that immediately activated to target her approach. Madison guided her fighter directly toward the carrier's main engine nacelle. This was the most heavily shielded part of the ship, but it was also the most critical. If she could damage the engines enough, the carrier would have to stop and the elven forces would have time to finish it. Stormfire and Thornwhisper flew on either side of her fighter, their forms shimmering as they prepared for the most dangerous attack they had attempted yet. The human ship's defensive systems opened fire with every weapon that could be brought to bear. Energy beams and missiles filled the space between Madison's fighter and the carrier. Her shields flared and dimmed under the barrage, and she knew they would not hold for long. But she did not slow down. She accelerated directly into the center of the fire, her fighter pushing to its absolute limits. Stormfire unleashed a thermal attack of such magnitude that it seemed to dwarf the carrier ship itself. The Silver Dragon's power had grown during the battle, drawing energy from the destruction around them and from the mystical forces of Orion itself. The attack struck the carrier's engines with devastating force, causing massive explosions that tore through the ship's propulsion systems. Thornwhisper created a shield of pure magical force that protected Madison's fighter from the worst of the carrier's defensive fire. The small green dragon was exhausted from the extended battle, but she kept the shield in place long enough for Madison to complete her attack. Madison fired her fighter's remaining weapons at the damaged engine, every projectile and energy blast striking true. The carrier ship began to slow, its engines failing under the combined assault. Madison pulled her fighter away from the dying vessel just as the entire engine section erupted in a catastrophic explosion. Stormfire and Thornwhisper followed her away from the destruction, their forms beginning to fade as their magical energy reserves became depleted. Madison guided her fighter back toward the planet, her two dragons struggling to keep pace with her. Behind them, the human fleet was in disarray. The carrier had been their command ship, and its destruction had disrupted the coordination of the human military forces. The remaining human vessels were beginning to disengage, preparing to retreat from the system. Lisa's voice came through on the command channel with orders for all units to continue their assault. The human fleet was vulnerable now, and the elven forces needed to press their advantage. But Madison was exhausted. Her dragons were barely holding together. She guided her fighter toward the atmosphere of Orion and began her descent toward Crystalline Haven. As her fighter touched down in the landing bay, Madison felt the weight of the battle settling over her. She had survived. Stormfire and Thornwhisper had survived, but so many others had not. The cost of defending their world had been high, and this was only the beginning of a much longer conflict. Her father was waiting for her when she opened the cockpit. Aldrin pulled his daughter out of the fighter and embraced her, tears streaming down his face. He told Madison that her actions had turned the tide of the battle. The council in Orel was finally acknowledging the reality of the conflict and the value of the hidden military forces. The elves were uniting now, setting aside their differences and their denial in the face of a threat that could no longer be ignored. Stormfire and Thornwhisper emerged from the cargo bay, their forms solid and real once again. The dragons approached Madison and pressed their great heads against her, their exhaustion as evident as her own. Through their mental link, Madison felt their emotions, pride in what they had accomplished, relief that they had survived, and determination for the battles that lay ahead. Over the next hours, reports came in from across the Orion system. The human fleet had stopped their retreat and was regrouping at the outer reaches of the system. They would attack again, probably with reinforcements and new tactics designed to counter the elven weapons and strategies. But for now, there was a moment of victory, a brief respite in what would be a long and costly war. Madison stood on the observation deck of Crystalline Haven and looked up at the stars where the human fleet lingered. She thought about the ancient warning in the archives, "Fear the Earthborn." She understood now that the warning was not about being afraid of them in the sense of cowering or surrendering. It meant respect them, learn from them, take them seriously as threats, and fight them with every ounce of strength and ingenuity that you could muster. The war was far from over, and the final outcome was still uncertain. But Madison knew one thing with absolute certainty. The elves would not go quietly into subjugation. They would fight for their world, their people, and their freedom. And with Stormfire and Thornwhisper at her side, Madison would lead them to victory or death. There would be no surrender.